Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host, Matt Karoly. Tonight, we are going to be talking about a lot of subjects, including the Falcons' Week 16 win over the Jacksonville Jaguars. We got a couple of plays that we want to break down on film. Thankfully, the All-22 just dropped within the last hour so that we can do that. We'll look ahead to the Week 17 matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We'll also, sort of in the holiday spirit, for any of you Seinfeld fans out there, we're going to air some grievances for those of you that do celebrate the special holiday of Festivus, in addition to Christmas and whatnot. And we'll get to that, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to take some of you guys live on the show for the call-in portion of the show. If you're watching us live on YouTube, you can get the link to how you want to join the show live in that chat coming up on today's episode. All you need is a laptop, a computer, or a phone, and you can join us live, and we'll talk with you guys directly about sort of maybe some grievances that you want to air, maybe some other issues that you want to discuss. But as we often do on this show, we sort of start things off talking a little bit about the roster moves and some of the injury updates. Not a whole lot going on with the roster in the last week since we first did this show a week ago. And, the main move that the Falcons made was putting James Carpenter on injured reserve with a concussion. They replaced him on the roster with Sean Harlow. He's back, my boy. They added two additions to the practice squad in Carroll Phillips and Tavon Salter. And the most notable thing I can say about Tavon Salter, because I only heard of him today when I found out that the Falcons signed him to the practice squad, is that his Twitter handle is Can'tGuard86. So for those of you guys that, have those online beefs with Michael Thomas over there with the Saints, and can't guard Mike and whatnot, the Falcons have their own version of that, and he probably, if he just runs a route more than 3 yards down the field, will already have more air yards than Michael Thomas does. But Matt, what are your thoughts on these recent roster moves?
Yeah, Salter's already a fan favorite for that Twitter handle alone, so hopefully we get to see him in action at some point and start those online debates that Tavon Salter is better than Michael Thomas. But not a whole lot to add. I thought the Carroll Phillips one was a little interesting last week. Phillips was a guy, that I remember watching throughout the pre-draft process of the 2017 draft from Illinois. He, along with Jaguars defensive end Dwayne Smoot, who actually had the one lone sack on the Falcons this week. Both those were interesting prospects. Obviously, I thought Smoot was the better player, but I thought Carroll Phillips had a game that kind of resembled Vic Beasley a little bit in that, he was a wiry, longer pass rusher that relied on his speed. And, he's bounced around, hasn't really, found a home, but he was on the Jaguars briefly, did have a little time with the Colts. And, the Falcons brought him onto the practice squad last week, I thought maybe as insurance for Vic Beasley, who was dealing with the undisclosed injury. But, it turns out, just going to stash him on the practice squad, and we'll see how long he lasts there. As far as Carpenter goes, again, it's been an unfortunate season for both the free agent guard acquisitions. Carpenter's battled injuries all throughout. He's now going to be shut down with those concussion issues. Brown had been nicked up too throughout the year, but he's been a healthy scratch now for the third straight week, and it looks like we've seen the last of him this year. And, it remains to be seen what his future in Atlanta is. Because on the off chance that they do keep, one of, if not both, Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff, you can almost guarantee, they're going to be looking to upgrade one of the guard spots again. Hopefully they don't make the same mistakes if they're around and continue to sink money into free agency. But, again, that's been the noticeable blemish. There's been several blemishes that we've noticed, but this one in particular has come to the forefront in these last couple of weeks, based on the fact that, again, he's a healthy scratch, Jamon Brown. And he's averaging $6 million per year on his contract. There's no clear out to his deal in 2020. So again, I'm hoping there's still hope for him, because I do think he's got a raw deal to a sense, in that while he hasn't been great, he hasn't been the worst guard by any means on this roster, and I didn't necessarily think he deserved to be cast aside the way he did. So again, this is why I'm kind of hoping for a new coaching staff, because I think there is some upside. There is some potential to at least get him to be a serviceable level player. He's probably always going to be that weakest link on the offensive line, but I don't think it's going to be a point where it really, it is a major liability. So again, hopefully there's still some hope there, and you can get some return on investment, because again, that's looking like a really terrible contract by the day. And as far as 2019 goes, I think the ship has sailed. You're not going to see him, and it's unfortunate, but we'll see what the future holds for him. So that's kind of my thoughts there. The one other thing I'll add as far as the roster goes that I'd like to get your thoughts on. If there's one Christmas wish I'd like to see for this Week 17 game, I would like to see Matt Gano get a shot at the starting left guard. Schweitzer, again, he hasn't been, he's probably the best guard that they've rolled out there. Aside from, when Gano was at right guard, it's a whole different ball game when you're jumping sides a little bit, seeing how he handles it there. But he hasn't been the worst guard. But again, I think you owe it, to, you as a staff. You brought this guy in here to try to evaluate him. And if you are going to be kept around, you got to know what you have here. And, I was very intrigued by him at right guard. I thought he did a pretty solid job, rotating in with Chris Lindstrom. And here, final week of the season, I'd like to see what he has to offer at left guard. I'm not very optimistic it'll happen, but if there's one wish of mine with this last game, it's that Matt Gano gets to start at left guard. What are your thoughts on that, Aaron? I mean, is that something you'd want to see as well? Or, what do you think the chances we actually end up seeing something like that?
Yes, I would love to see it. No, I don't think we will see it.
Yeah.
I think going back to the point you made about Jamon Brown in terms of him getting a raw deal, I would, certainly agree with you on that point. I would argue that, you weren't this vocal with defending the raw deal that I personally thought Ben Garland got last year, with him getting benched in favor of Zane Beadles at the end of the season after one, particularly poor performance against the Saints. But prior to that, had played pretty well for the 3 or 4 previous games up to that point. So I just want to say that this is nothing new for the Falcons to basically scapegoat an offensive lineman that reasonably is playing well, or at least decently. So that has happened in the past. And, I think in terms of him being the weak link, I think that's kind of the way that you have to work in this league. It's very rare for you to have 5 good offensive linemen. I know the Cowboys had it that one year where I think Lyle Collins was at left guard, and they had was it Collins?
Was it Ronald Leary? Maybe
Leary was at left guard. Yeah, you're right. That one year where they had 5 legitimately good offensive linemen, and then I think Leary left next year, and they moved Collins, and it's never really been the same. So you're really kind of hoping to get 4 good starting offensive linemen. That's kind of the best case scenario for an offensive line. And I think the issue the Falcons have been dealing with is, Matthews has played well. Mack certainly hasn't played like the player that we've gotten used to seeing over these last couple of years. He's started to pick things up these last couple of weeks. We're hoping Lindstrom and McGarry can continue to rise. So this is something we've talked about on previous episodes of the podcast, where we went sort of deeper on the expectations that, this offensive line may not need as much work to sort of get it to play well in 2020 as maybe some people sort of perceive based off of this 2019 season. So whatever the Falcons do at left guard, whether it's keep a guy like Schweitzer, who is a free agent after this season, keeping a guy like Jamon Brown, keeping a guy like Carpenter, or giving an opportunity to Matt Gano, or bringing in someone new, preferably via the draft. I think if you're putting your stock in sort of the Falcons massively upgrading that left guard spot, I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath on that. But I think you can be a little bit more optimistic, sort of that maybe the other 4 guys will play considerably better in 2020. And if that's the case, then you could see this Falcons offensive line certainly have a bounce back year next year.
Yeah. Yeah. And the one thing, I'll add about Garland, and again, it's kind of unfortunate how with offensive line play and cornerback play, I think is very similar. Is, when you're really bad, it's noticeable. And I think that was what happened to Garland on that Thanksgiving night game on national television, is he was really bad and it was noticeable. And, whether it was right or wrong, because I do think there were moments where he was good. Like his highs were pretty high, but his lows were pretty low. And, the Falcons, again, like you said, they scapegoated him. And I just don't think we've seen that necessarily with Brown. Like when he's been bad, he's just been bad, but it hasn't been super noticeable. So that's why for me, that's why it's kind of stood out. But I will say, the Pro Football Focus grades backed it up. Ben Garland was the best guard that the Falcons had last year, but when he was bad, that was the issue, and they were kind of just looking for that consistency. And I think you get that more with Brown. It's just the consistency maybe isn't the high level play that maybe you would want. But like you said, when you got 5 offensive linemen, there's going to be one weak link there. And if it's Jamon Brown, I don't think that's such a bad thing. But we'll see. We're not going to see it. I don't think. I find it hard to believe if Dan Quinn is kept around, we wouldn't see Jamon Brown back in a starting role moving forward. So you're going to have an expensive backup in 2020 if that's the case. But with the new coaching staff, which is the hope, maybe there's hope and potential still to get something out of him, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think, the question I think really at this point in time with both Carpenter and Brown, I know the Falcons can get out of the Carpenter deal. I don't know, I'd have to recheck his contract because I don't know if his contract is guaranteed for injury next year. And now that he's on IR, it kind of locks them in. I know that's a situation with Keanu Neal with that 5th-year option because he's hurt. They can't cut him. I know that's
wasn't that a thing with Brendan Fusco though? He was on IR last year, but then they cut him for an injury designation type of deal.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I think they could get out of it in that regard. But you and I were both talking about.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I remember talking.
The cap savings for Carpenter. If we don't have post June 1 cuts, which right now we don't have, the savings isn't that much by trying to get out of Carpenter's deal. So I know you had made the point to me that there might be a situation where he's in camp and you have a competition, and that's certainly possible. Based on that fact. That's why, again, I'm hoping the CBA gets done as quickly as possible so that those post June 1 cuts come back, because then that's going to make things a lot easier for the Falcons to get in a better cap situation.
Yeah. So I think, the interesting thing to watch with both Brown and Carpenter is if the Falcons decide to shop either one of those players, whether that's in March, whether that's in August. I think those are 2 potential candidates that we could be looking at as guys that the Falcons could potentially move maybe ahead of the draft for, late round picks. You're probably not going to get much for those guys. No. You're talking maybe a 7th for Carpenter and maybe probably like a 6th for Brown, maybe a 5th if some team is really desperate. But that is something that just sort of, keep in the back of your mind as an option potentially available to the Falcons, particularly if they do opt to re-sign Schweitzer sort of as the incumbent left guard. And then, they also have Gano as an option, and then, potentially add another body in the draft as well. So that's something that the Falcons could explore as a possibility next offseason, as far as shaking up their offensive line and trying to get out of those contracts that Matt mentioned, as certainly sitting here today look pretty awful at this point in time. But any other thoughts on the roster and the injuries and before we get into this all 22?
Nope, I think we can jump right into it.
Okay. All right.
So we are going to highlight first Deion Jones, correct?
Yes.
So we wanted to get Deion Jones into this all-22 breakdown this season. He hasn't made the splashy plays like we're accustomed to seeing, via the interceptions and all that. But he's still been, a pretty solid player, one of the better linebackers in football on a play-to-play basis. Here was a great play. And Aaron, if you want to kind of highlight a little bit of what you saw from a coverage standpoint, Falcons here kind of, had a pretty good disguise on.
Yeah, so on this particular play, guys, you're going to see the Falcons line up as if they're in man coverage. What's going to sort of tip it off, if you're the quarterback and you're scanning the defensive formation, is that you're going to see Devondre Campbell here at the top of the screen lined up against the tight end. And anytime you sort of split a linebacker out wide to cover, a tight end or a running back that's split out wide, almost, probably 99% of the time, that's going to signal man coverage. So when Gardner Minshew's scanning the defense, he's thinking, okay, we're going to get man coverage against the Falcons. But what the Falcons do, and they did this week, they did this a couple of times last week, really haven't seen them do it a ton this year, really prior to the last two games, is disguise their coverage. And at the snap, they're going to switch into zone coverage, and they're going to play a pretty basic cover two. That's going to lead to Bleedy Ray Wilson being able to sort of jump that seam throw. And then, of course, Deion Jones is going to be able to wind up breaking it up on that particular play. But that's one of those things where it's an interesting wrinkle in terms of what the Falcons are doing defensively and sort of building a little bit with their defensive play calling to try to confuse quarterbacks, which, has been a knock on the Dan Quinn defense over the years, which is sort of how vanilla and how predictable that they have been over the years. And, that's maybe one of the interesting wrinkles that Raheem Morris and to a lesser extent, Jeff Ulbrich is bringing to the table, disguising some of the coverages.
Yeah, and you can see just, the speed of Deion Jones being on full display, going from the right hash all the way to the left hash and kind of getting his hand in at the very second just to knock that ball away. Because, had he not been able to do that, it does look like, who is that? D.D. Westbrook, right?
Yeah, I think that's
D.D. Westbrook on the second go at it probably would have had that ball and converted that third down. And first drive of the game after the Falcons put up 14, and you can force them into 3 and out thanks to Deion Jones. I mean, that was a great play there, getting off the field. And, again, not super flashy, but certainly you see his speed. You see why he's such an asset on the field.
And this play, I think, even does a better job displaying his speed. He's going to be right here in the middle of defense. They're going to run a screen to DJ Chark on the outside, and he's going to come in and basically take off Chark's head and close line.
And they have it blocked pretty well. And, you kind of see Devonta Casey getting free a little bit of the block,
right
near the 50-yard line. But DeMonte hasn't always been the most reliable in the open field when it comes to tackling. He's not on Ricardo Allen's level when it comes to that.
You can see that if Casey doesn't make if Jones isn't there and Casey doesn't make this tackle, Chark has a lot of room to run, and this is probably potentially a touchdown because I don't know if Allen has the angle to be able to get over there and make that play. Yeah,
I mean, Chark's a 4.3 guy, but so is Deion Jones, and because of that, that's allowing him to cover all that ground and make a great play and save what likely was a touchdown for the Jaguars. So again, these are not some of the things you're seeing in the box score with the interceptions and forced fumbles and all that, but this was a great play by Deion Jones, and part of the reason why he's such a good linebacker and why, again, he's such an asset for this Falcons defense.
So we want to switch gears to the offensive side of the ball. We want to highlight a big catch that Julio Jones had. Was this on the first or second series, I think it was, where Julio's going to run a corner and Matt Ryan's just going to put a perfect ball there in that spot where only Julio can get it. And Julio's going to make a great catch in traffic, sandwich between two defenders. We'll show it again.
As they say, there's no defense for the perfect pass, and that's kind of what happened here. I mean, this, I said it on Twitter. I think this is Matt's best throw of the entire season. I mean, he hit Julio in stride. You can argue maybe the Carolina game with the Luke Kuechly play was nice, but I think the one thing with that, Julio had to slow down a bit. This one, that wasn't the case. Julio can run right through it. And again, just perfect ball placement. But, one of the reasons we want to highlight it, and Aaron's going to talk a little bit more, is about Julio in the slot here. And again, this is something that's become a theme the last couple of weeks. So Aaron, I'll let you take it away on what you've seen there with Julio in the slot.
Yeah, particularly the last two games against the 49ers and now against the Jaguars, we've seen Julio get a lot more work in the slot. And one of the things Matt and I were sort of talking about is kind of a direct response to the Ridley injury. It's not that Ridley was getting a ton of work in the slot himself since the Sanu trade, but it's just because the Falcons realized that they have to kind of funnel their offense through Julio Jones with Ridley being out of the lineup. And, obviously Hooper and Gage are making plays and certainly made a number of plays in this game, but Julio's going to be their sort of bread and butter of their passing game. And one of the benefits of having your receiver play in the slot, and this has been the case, is you get a lot more single coverage. It's much harder to give the inside corner playing that slot the safety help because of, typical coverages, you're going to have, the safety help going to more the outside or being stuck in the middle of the field and not being able to make some of those plays on a particular route like that, where you have Julio going towards the sideline. So that's been something that's been noticeable, and probably will continue to see this upcoming week, where Julio gets a lot more opportunities in the slot and gets a lot more targets coming out of that slot moving forward. And that will be something to sort of see, presumably if the Falcons have a different coaching staff, whether or not that's something that continues into 2020 with this current coaching staff or with a different one moving forward. So where am I?
So the next play we want to highlight is a Devonta Freeman play. And, this game was kind of very reminiscent of 2015 when the offense was kind of, being carried by Julio and Devonta. And I thought, this arguably could have been Devonta's best game of the season. He showed it both as a running back, as a runner and as a passer. And on this one, this was just a great play by him, kind of running a wheel route. Hooper sets somewhat of a pick, doesn't really necessarily affect the linebacker, I guess, running with Devonta up the field too much, but, enough room. Devonta's able to shield him as he's turning and just, again, makes a great play, great adjustment on the ball. And, just showing his all-around skill set as a running back, not only as a runner, but he can offer you some of these things as a passer. And, we haven't seen a whole lot of it, where we've kind of seen this play usually is, Devonta would break it off into the flat and Matt would hit him with a quick little hitch to get, 5-6 yards. Here, they kind of let the play develop a little longer and let it become a wheel route, and, to get more yards down the field. And, again, Matt makes a good enough throw for Devonta to make a play on it. And again, this was one of Devonta's, better plays I think he's made all season. He's had 57 catches on the season and none more impressive than this one. So great play by him to extend the drive on 3rd and 4. And just, again, great all-around game by Devonta Freeman.
Yeah, one more look at the throw by Matt here and the catch. There you have it. Okay, guys, there's our sort of all 22 breakdown. It's nice to be pointing out some positives with this Falcon team the last couple of weeks, than necessarily looking at some negative plays and calling some people out, as we have done for most of this season. So that's something that certainly want to continue talking about.
We'll get those call outs in a little bit later with the airing of grievances for sure. Yeah, but yeah, it is nice to finally be talking these last couple of weeks about some good plays on the field. So you want to talk about this next matchup, this season finale with the Bucs? How do you want to structure the rest of the show here?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to jump into that. Okay. This is also a great opportunity for many of you guys to sort of join the show, and I'll be posting the link that you can click in the chat. For those of you, whether you decide you want to join us today or tonight, certainly we would like you to like and subscribe, and share, retweet, do whatever you can to share this stellar Falcons content here on the Falcons Central Radio program that we have here. Again, if you want to join us live and air your grievances later on in the episode, or just talk about whatever you want to talk about, by all means, check out that link in the chat. You just need a phone or a computer. It doesn't really matter. And it's as simple as that. So let's look ahead to this Week 17 matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We're back in a situation where the Falcons have an opportunity to beat the Bucs in the season finale, and it obviously has, probably not as dramatic an impact on the draft standings as it did a year ago, but certainly it will impact their schedule, because if they win this game, I understand it, they'll finish second place in the NFC South, and therefore will have to face teams potentially like Dallas or Philadelphia, as well as Seattle, I think, next year. Yeah. And if they don't, then they get to play, our favorite Danny Dimes and the New York Giants instead. And then the Rams, I guess, again. So certainly could wind up having an impact on 2020. Not as dramatic as losing out on the Ed Oliver sweepstakes, as so many people thought last year. But
Man, I didn't even just to give a spoil, I didn't even include that on my airing of grievances, but I kind of wish I did now because that's certainly something I was disappointed about. But
I was a little surprised to see you not put it in
yeah,
there.
no, totally forgot all about that.
But this week 17 matchup, it's going to should be at least in theory a lot easier for the Falcons from a defensive standpoint because you're not dealing with the Buccaneers having a full deck of cards, particularly at the wide receiver position. Chris Godwin missed last week's game against the Texans with a hamstring injury. Mike Evans is on IR, and we know Godwin absolutely destroyed the Falcons in that previous matchup against the Bucs. And obviously Mike Evans has historically destroyed the Falcons several times in previous matchups. And so if you take those two players off the table for the Buccaneers, what else do they really have from a weapon standpoint through the air? We saw Ronald Jones make some plays, and the valuable piece. We know Jameis Winston plays his best football against the Falcons. He likes to throw picks early in games, and then he likes to dig himself out of those holes. And we'll see if that, maybe plays to the Falcons' favor if that happens for seemingly the 15th consecutive week this upcoming Sunday. But Matt, sort of, what are you looking at in this Bucs matchup that's certainly intriguing you at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, and I don't think it's getting talked about enough from a national media standpoint with the Bucs is, they finally might have a defense this year. Coming into last week, they were 9th overall in terms of DVOA's total overall defense, and that might go up based on their last performance against the Texans when they kind of held Sean Watson in check. They're first against the run, so they're stopping the run with Ndamukong Suh and Vita Vea up front. So I worry a little bit about can Devonta Freeman string another good performance? I have my doubts about that. Hopefully, I'm pleasantly surprised and they're able to get something going there. But I do think this is going to be a game where it's going to come down to Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, and hopefully Julio can have one more Herculean effort. Because again, I think the Bucs finally maybe figured out their cornerback room, and guys like Jamel Dean, the rookie from Auburn, certainly making plays. Sean Bunting looks like a pretty solid pick. And they have one other guy. Who am I forgetting from their cornerback room? Bunting, Dean.
A rookie or
Carlton Davis. Davis is another one that I think might stick around. Again,
he played really well last time.
Yes, absolutely. I was just going to say that. Good physical guy. I know you mentioned part of the reason they brought him in was to go up against, the likes of Julio Jones and Michael Thomas in this division. And he certainly fared pretty well in that first matchup, holding a guy like Julio in check, who Julio usually goes off against the Bucs. And again, Julio got that record 12,000, which was nice to see, fastest to 12,000 this past week. He's got a little bit more up at stake this week, 84 yards away from posting his 6th consecutive 1,400-yard season, which would extend his own personal record, NFL all-time record, most consecutive 1,400-yard season. So, again, I think if whoever wins that matchup again, if the Bucs corners can get the better of Julio, I tend to like the Bucs in this matchup just because, again, I think they have a defense that's worth talking about for once. Todd Bowles has made a tremendous impact. And again, if Julio can go off, then I think they have a chance. But if not, I mean, that's where I think this game comes down to, in my opinion. That's one of the first things I'm looking at.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's kind of important, going back to what we talked about when we broke down the All-22, sort of the importance of, Julio's effectiveness playing out of the slot. And because the expectation is that you're not really going to expect Carlton Davis to sort of travel with Julio when he goes into the slot. And that's going to potentially present more matchups where you can get Julio Jones against Sean Bunting instead of Julio Jones against Carlton Davis, who, as Matt mentioned, was really effective in that previous matchup going up against Julio Jones. And so that's going to be something that's going to be interesting to sort of see how the Falcons handle that. And if that's the case, sort of what adjustments Todd Bowles makes with this Bucs defense that you're right has played particularly well this year. I think there was a couple of seasons ago where they were pretty high in DVOA. I think it was the first year under Mike Smith, and then they completely bottomed out the next 2 years. So I've sort of seen this song and dance before with the Buccaneers, where they look very promising defensively one year and then are terrible the next year.
Well, who do you trust more from a defensive coach?
That was going to be the point I was going to bring.
Yeah.
I think Todd Bowles' record suggests that this is something that is a lot more. You got to feel a lot more optimistic if you're a Bucs fan that this is sustainable, particularly when those young cornerbacks continue to grow and they continue to supplement their pass rush, particularly if they can retain someone like Shaq Barrett, who I'm sure we will talk about later in the episode when we start talking about some of the grievances and gripes that we have based off of the
Falcons didn't have Austin Hooper in that first match against the Bucs, did they? That was one of the games he was out.
I think you're right. I think that's right.
Yeah, because I think he got hurt in the Saints game, first Saints game.
I am double checking as we speak.
So hopefully, again, you're going to need a guy, I think, to take a little bit of pressure off of Julio, because I don't expect him to be in the slot every single rep.
Yeah.
And
Hooper did miss that game.
And Hooper's, I think you saw a little bit last week. He did have a drop. He did have kind of a mental mistake, in my opinion, late in the first half, kind of getting out of bounds when I thought there was a touchdown in play. But the point I'm trying to make, though, is I think he's getting more comfortable now off the injury. He was more of a presence this week than he was in the first 2 games back. So I'm hoping for one more last good one. I think, I don't know how much we can count on Devonta Freeman in the run game. Maybe he'll make a difference in the pass game, but you're definitely going to have to find that second guy. Maybe it's Russell Gage being a surprise. I mean, he's been a steady contributor. But the point is, again, they're going to have to find a guy to help move the chains a little bit, because I do think this might be more of a grinded out game with this Bucs defense, making them one-dimensional since they're so good against the run. Jumping to the flip side of the ball, again, Godwin's injury is something to monitor, as Aaron said. They're not going to have Mike Evans. They didn't have Godwin last week. If Godwin goes in the finale, which he hasn't been placed on IR or anything, so he's not ruled out, that certainly is going to help them. Because again, if not, you're looking at Rashad Perryman and a whole host of new faces, unknown faces, for him to throw the ball to, from the receiver position. So, you kind of saw it these last couple of weeks with some of the receiver talent that the Falcons have faced. They've been able to match up well. But if a guy like Godwin's out there, that's certainly a guy, voted to his first Pro Bowl, having an all-pro caliber season. We saw what he could do in that first matchup with some of the ridiculous catches he made. So if he can go, again, that certainly shifts the balance of power again, I think, in my opinion, to the Bucs. But if he doesn't go, I think it's certainly, in my opinion, again, going to come down to maybe last possession of the game, just like last year's finale did. Because, again, I think this is going to be a knock him out, drag him out style of game. Or, it could be a shootout. But in any event, I think it's going to be close. And we'll see. I certainly want this one. I know it doesn't matter. We're talking about 2 teams not going to the playoffs. But again, there's bragging rights on the line, especially in division games. I certainly would like to see them go 7-9. At worst, I think I was looking at Tankathon and how the draft picks work. I think right now the Falcons are picking 13th, and really I think 15th is looking likely if they win this game. So you were talking about a two spot drop. I don't think that's a whole lot to be mad about. And as far as the schedule goes, we have no idea who's going to be good in 2020. It's a long way away. Lots going to change. If you're playing the Seahawks next year, the point I've been making on Twitter is the Seahawks have won 10 of 11 games by 1 score. So you're likely due for some regression there in Seattle. And they might not be, despite having one of the better quarterbacks, they might not be, a 10-win, 11-win team next year. And they might be, a 7, 6, 8-win team. So, again, you never know. On the surface, it doesn't look great. But I don't think that's something that really should be a worry, because again, a lot's going to change. We don't know what the future holds. We don't even know who the head coach is going to be for the Falcons. But I'd like to see them finish strong, get in second place, and finish this last quarter 4-0. I mean, that would be, again, you can say a lot about Dan Quinn, but it is commendable for them to kind of rally and finish this season strong and would go 6-2, post bye.
Yeah. And those sort of, we're talking about sort of who steps up, and if Godwin, when Mike Evans doesn't play in this game. And the thing that you notice with the Bucs offense the last couple of weeks when those guys have been limited has been that they've been running a lot more of their offense through the tight end position. In that previous matchup with the Falcons, in part due to Chris Godwin, why throw it to anybody not named Chris Godwin in that game based off of how he played? But O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate only combined for 3 targets in that game. And I think maybe for 2 catches. In the last 3 weeks combined, they've had 35 targets, which is almost a dozen per game, just over the last 3 games when they've had some of these injuries. And we've known that the Falcons, particularly against San Francisco, obviously with George Kittle, but Ian Thomas made some plays in that Carolina game. We know Jared Cook's had some success in recent weeks against the Falcons coverage. And so if the tight end position is much more heavily featured going up against this Falcons defense, that could create some additional problems for this defense moving forward. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on, that Devondre Campbell matchup that he has with O.J. Howard as well as Cameron Brate. So that's something to keep an eye on in Week 17.
We want to get to the grievances now. Do we have any? I guess we have no callers at the moment. Right?
No, we do not.
Right.
But you guys, of course, can find that link in the chat. I'll post it one more time as I let Matt start us off.
So, most loyal listeners probably have an idea of maybe where I'm heading with this first one. But, for me, this is something that, I'll never really be able to forgive Dan Quinn on. And one of the top reasons I think, he needs to go. And for me, it was firing Steve Sarkisian with no clear and obvious upgrade waiting in the wings. Now, it's been well documented and well speculated on that he was probably waiting on Gary Kubiak, and that offer was blocked. But if that's what you were resting your hopes on, I mean, you have to be pretty certain that you're going to be able to talk to him. You're going to be able to kind of hook, line, and sink him and get him to accept the position with Atlanta. If that's not the case, hiring a retread, hiring someone that again. The track record kind of speaks for itself. I mean, you look back on Atlanta's offenses under Dirk Cutter in terms of DVOA in 2012, 2014. He was 12th overall, 14th overall, and 10th overall. With the pass, it was 10th rated passing in 2012, 11th rated passing in 2013, 8th rated passing in 2014. So not bad numbers there. But then you look at the run game, 30th run, 21st in the run in 2013, and 22nd in the run in 2014. He kind of made it kind of clear why, or the excuse for why Steve Sarkisian was let go was because, his rushing game, the run game wasn't effective under him, or he didn't feature it enough. But if that's the reason, you look at what Dirk Cutter did from a run game standpoint, it just doesn't add up. So for me, firing Steve Sarkisian and then quickly, as your plan B being Dirk Cutter and rushing right into it without surveying the rest of the market. I mean, I know I was kind of down on a guy like Darrell Bevel, but I'm willing to eat my words on that. Darrell Bevel, prior to Matt Stafford's injury, was doing some good things with Stafford in that offense. Leading Stafford to having one of his career best year. So what could have been maybe if he had hired his former colleague in Seattle, Darrell Bevel, we might be sitting in a different position. I might be singing a different tune as far as keeping Dan Quinn or not. But for me, ever since he made that move, and obviously it hasn't worked out like he planned, I just feel like that's when things kind of got away from him. The pressure started to mount to him, and he kind of lost control of the direction of his team. And for me, that's my biggest, Falcons grievance in 2019 was firing Steve Sarkisian without a clear and obvious plan for an upgrade.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, I just kind of think, you're talking about Darrell Bevel. He's basically running the offense that I was hoping that we would run, and kind of the offense that Todd Monken ran in Tampa Bay last year, which is heavy play action, heavy vertical passing game. And unfortunately, that's not what they're
Yeah,
called
I
for.
was wrong. I was wrong on him. I didn't think we would see that, and maybe it had something to do with his time in Seattle. Russell Wilson was a younger quarterback, so he didn't want to put as much on his plate. But yeah, he certainly took the time off and used it wisely and evolved as a play caller because prior to that Stafford injury, Lions were quietly doing some good things on offense. So again, I'm going to eat my words there. Darrell Bevel probably should have been the choice if they couldn't have gotten Gary Kubiak.
So, my major grievance goes all the way back to the very first episode I believe we did in 2019, where we had our good friend Evan Birchfield on. And I think the three of us were all in kind of agreement with the Falcons' plan of attack, how they should have approached the offseason, which was take whatever limited money that they had to spend in free agency and invest that mostly in their front four, mostly in their front seven on defense to sort of fix many of the issues that the Falcons displayed on that defensive side of the ball in 2018. And, a big part of that was that you were getting a particularly deep free agent crop of pass rushers. I know Matt had a list of players that he was desperate for the Falcons to go out and sign, and every week on the show was kind of scratching his head. It's like, okay, there's still time for them to go out there and get Justin Houston and whoever else was on that list. And I was just kind of shaking my head. It's like, well, that's not what the Falcons are going to do, but it's certainly what they should have done. And instead, they, of course, decided that they wanted to spend their free agent money on offensive linemen, even though it was kind of a historically bad free agent class as far as offensive linemen went. And it was a particularly good draft class as far as offensive linemen went. So if you were going to make significant upgrades to your offensive line, it was likely going to come in the draft and not in free agency, that you were going to spend a lot of money to make marginal upgrades. And this was something that I think we talked about at the very beginning of 2019. And now that we're at the end of 2019, I think we've been vindicated in that assessment. And so that was sort of my first sort of grievance, is just like, I think the Falcons' plan, if you can call it that, based off of some of the very questionable moves that they made, it kind of seemed like they were flying by the seat of their pants for much of the offseason. But their plan was a highly, highly flawed one, and I think has led directly to some of the issues that this team has dealt with this season.
Yeah, and your first grievance is a great segue into my second one, which I got a little bit more specific with it. And for me, it was not rescinding Vic Beasley's fifth-year option, which I know the timing of this one maybe isn't the greatest, just because Vic has played somewhat decent. They're using
not $13 million decent though.
No, that's absolutely true, and why I still think it's a very perfect grievance to grieve about, because again, they could have used those money, and I tweeted this several months ago. They could have used those funds and signed both Shaq Barrett and Gerald McCoy and still had a little under $1 million left, which for me, that's just mind-blowing. Again, I don't think anyone expected Shaq Barrett to have this type of breakout. We all thought, both me and you and others thought Shaq Barrett would have been a great, cost-effective signing. And oh boy, was that, more than right. I mean, Shaq Barrett having a breakout, 16.5 sack campaign, Pro Bowler. But even if he didn't even give you that, I mean, I still thought that's where the money, getting two players for one, would have been the way to go. Getting a guy like Gerald McCoy, a locker room leader, who, again, while the Panthers haven't had a great season and it's not going to get talked about, he's still doing, normal Gerald McCoy things: 6 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, 13 quarterback hits this year. Putting that next to Grady Jarrett, that would have only made Grady Jarrett, I think, even more dominant. So for me, it was not rescinding Vic Beasley's fifth-year option and using that money more wisely, using those $13 million to get potentially 2 impact players on the defensive line. Like you said, that's where this free agency crop was at its best. And that's what they should have done, rather than, sink money into 2, middling guards, use it on the D line. And then they could have done the same thing they did in the draft and really went heavy on the O line, and we'd be in a much better spot. But they did not do that. And now the only hope with this whole keeping Vic Beasley, on this 5th-year option is that, he's parlaying this uptick in play into a new contract elsewhere that can potentially give the Falcons, a decent comp pick in 2021. But that all comes down to how much they're going to be active in free agency themselves, which, again, I'm not expecting, but we'll see all different moves that might potentially happen over these next couple months. So, yeah.
Yeah, and look, the last point I'll make about the offensive line and why sort of bringing up Schweitzer and Ben Garland earlier on today's episode is that you can argue, as I think was kind of the argument being made last, at the beginning of the year, which is why, Schweitzer, Garland, while not great offensive linemen, are no different and certainly have played arguably better than either what Jamon Brown or James Carpenter did. So you're spending all this money to basically, at best, make a lateral move. And based off of how those guys have performed this year, you can argue that those have been downgrades. And so that was kind of the thought behind the process. Yeah, Schweitzer and Garland aren't great starters for you, but certainly serviceable starters, and use that money elsewhere. But my second grievance is, and I know people are going to be like, based off of how, some of the heroics that Younghoe Koo has done in recent weeks, particularly as far as the onside kicking game goes, it's like, who cares? But still got to go back, speaking of Evan Birchfield, to sort of how the team handled the Matt Bryant situation. They just kind of crapped the bed from the start. They should have never let him go to begin with, replacing him with Koo. In the end, certainly you can argue in hindsight was the right move at the time when they made it. Although Koo has been probably shakier from beyond 40 than I think people are talking about. So we'll sort of have to see how that moves forward. But certainly he's a guy that has played well at times this year, particularly as a kickoff guy, and certainly deserves an opportunity to compete for this starting job next year. I wouldn't necessarily hand it to him quite yet based off of the second half of the season. But I think really the situation with Matt Bryant was one of those where I think the Falcons should have retained him from the start. They should have had him brought into camp to compete with Giorgio Tavecchio, and presumably that he would have won that competition in camp, would have only decided to move on from Matt Bryant at the point where they did the season, where we saw some of those struggles that he had, particularly from long distance. Although one of the points that Matt in particular made at the time when the Falcons cut Matt Bryant was that really, had he only made one more field goal from beyond 50 yards, he would have been performing at an league average level up to that point. So he was really only one long field goal away from being, at worst, a league average kicker. But so I just kind of think the Falcons, if Koo winds up being the long-term solution, they really kind of back their way into this, botch their way into it, to put it in a better way. And
that's kind of the same things you were saying as far as them backing into Matt Bryant when they re-signed him back in September. Is Tavecchio didn't do well in the preseason, and I made the point that this was in their back pocket all along, but you were like, no, they kind of backed into it, and so yeah, I think you're right that this was a great one just because it just highlighted a whole bunch of incompetence on their part.
This is going to be kind of the theme of my airing of grievances, where just the Falcons are just kind of throwing stuff at a wall, hoping something will stick, as opposed to really having a plan,
right.
Which I think, obviously we talked about it pretty much every week, but it's kind of an indictment of this current regime in terms of people feeling confident that, that you can bring, whether it's Quinn, whether it's Dimitrov, both of these guys back and really expect better results in 2020.
Because didn't they work out Koo and they worked out Blair Walsh?
Yeah, they signed Blair Walsh.
And they signed Blair Walsh, and then they saw Blair Walsh make both of his kicks, right? Or did he miss one?
No, he missed one.
Okay, yeah, because then that makes sense why. And then they went to Bryant, and then now, like you said, they kind of just fell into Koo, and Koo's been okay, but he's certainly the kicking hasn't looked all that like. It's not been confident, like seeing the ball off the foot hasn't looked confident. Like it's ducked more times than it's looked like a clean, crisp kick. So again, I don't know how sustainable Younghoe Koo is, I guess appreciate what he's doing with the onside kick game while we have it, and some of the maybe impressive tackles or fumble recoveries on the kickoff. But I don't know if he's necessarily the long-term guy, but we'll see what happens there. My third one, I'm going to go to the draft with this one. And, as I said earlier, I'm not going to talk about Ed Oliver, although that certainly would classify as a grievance. But I think the reason why, I'm okay with, and I made my peace with Ed Oliver, is I do think Chris Lindstrom's a great player and going to be a key fixture on this offensive line for years to come. So it's not like, they would have had to trade up and give up, the opportunity of getting a Caleb McGarry too, who I think Caleb McGarry and Chris Lindstrom can form a pretty solid duo on the right side for years to come. So that's why I'm not so bent out of shape that yet Oliver stuff didn't happen for me. And this was one of my, themes of the article that I wrote when I kind of, recapped the Falcons 2019 draft class was, I made the point to say that I thought this draft class would be good for Matt Ryan in his future, keeping him upright, keeping him clean for the foreseeable future. But it wasn't going to be a draft class that would save Dan Quinn or Thomas Dimitroff's jobs. And we'll see if that ends up being true or not in a week or so. But for me, on day 3, since they had no day 2 picks, if you're going to save your job, you want to get as many guys as you can that can help you out right away. And I think with the drafting of John Kaminsky and the drafting of Quadri Allison, that wasn't necessarily the case. And again, when you're drafting in the moment, you're thinking long term when drafting. I mean, that's the whole point of drafting. It's not just for the present, it's for the future. But with all the pressure mounting on them, knowing that this was going to be a make or break season, I mean, you saw it with the firings of this coaching staff. Is Dan Quinn felt the heat and the pressure to get back to the playoffs and the Super Bowl. So there was obviously pressure there. And for me, drafting a guy in Kaminsky who coming from the D2 level, sure, he's got the athletic traits to succeed in the NFL, but this is why we're not seeing him a whole lot. I mean, it was unfortunate he got the ankle injury, but this is kind of why, we're not seeing him a lot. He got beat out by JTM, who kind of took over his spot and is seeing the bulk of the reps that he would have seen. And I mean, you could put anyone in here. I put Foster Moreau. I was a big fan of him. Obviously, we're seeing how much the 2 tight end sets are important in this offense. And, I would have much rather have Foster Moreau and his blocking prowess, mixed in with his athletic acumen and his ability as a pass catcher over a Luke Stocker. But again, you could have put anybody there that, fell in the draft beyond the John Kaminsky pick. For me, it would have been Foster Moreau. And then for Allison, I would have taken either Chalmers Amanahu, the defensive end from Texas, who, has shown and, has been a contributor already as a 5th round pick. Or I believe he might have fell to the 6th round, which again, it's hard to believe. He was one of those shockers that fell, but certainly could have been, an upgrade over John Kaminsky and would have seen more playing time, and could have mixed in with Alan Bailey there at strong side defensive end. Or Mac Wilson was another candidate, the linebacker from Alabama, who's made some plays already for the Cleveland Browns. I thought linebacker was going to be in need. Not only in the present, but in the future as a potential successor to Devondre Campbell. But again, with this exercise, you could have put any of your favorites that fell that, you felt were going to contribute sooner than the guys that they drafted. And I think, with John Kaminsky and Quadri Allison, I didn't see those guys in year 1 contributing. And I think, if you're in a position like Dimitroff and Quinn were, that, time is of the essence, you need to use your picks wisely and use them on, guys that can help you in the present. And so that would have been my third grievance for the Falcons, is those 2 picks never really, I never really saw the vision in the present. Now, again, we'll see what they do in the future, and maybe they turn out to be contributors, but I still have my doubts about Kaminsky. And then as far as Allison goes, I mean, he's going to have to add something as a pass catcher to really be, a fixture. I mean, it's nice to see him get these goal line carries and contribute them and be a touchdown vulture, but to be a good pick, you got to provide more than that. So we'll see what the future holds for those guys. But in the here and now, I would have much rather had Foster Moreau or Charles Amanahu. Yeah,
you're right. You can't build a career out of being a goal line guy. Just like Younghoe Koo can't build a career out of onside kicks. On average, you're going to have less than 2 onside kicks a year. That's not enough for you to basically justify keeping a kicker if he can't do the things that essentially he's got to do every week, which is make field goals, make point after touchdowns, which again, not to sit here and act like Koo has been terrible in that regard, but that's kind of the point where don't let a very handful of quote unquote special plays outshine the fact that your job as a running back, and certainly a guy, with Allison, I think the benefit that he has is that special teams ability is going to be a nice fallback for him so that he can find a role in the league. But as far as, being a force as a running back, I think you're right. He's going to have to be a much better option, not only as a receiver, but as a pass protector, and be a little bit more of a dynamic runner in this league if he's going to stick in that role. For me, my third grievance, I think, is really, kind of piggybacking a little bit off of what you said, particularly with this sort of John Kaminsky thing. But there was really no plan for the Falcons to upgrade their defense this offseason based off of what they did in free agency and in the draft. And, their plan was essentially to coach up the guys that they had currently assembled. And I think when we're sort of potentially doing the autopsy on this coaching staff and this regime, I think we're going to look back in particular at these 2018 and 2019 off seasons, particularly when we look at the pass rush and the lack of investments that the Falcons have made in their pass rush the last two off seasons, where in 2018 they drafted Deidre Sanat, who's a run stopper. In 2019 they drafted John Kaminsky, who, as Matt said, is a bit of a project there. And we've talked about the parallels between 2014 and 2019. And that was interesting that in 2014 in that draft, they drafted a bunch of projects like Hageman, like Desmond Southward early in that draft that weren't necessarily going to contribute right away to help that coaching staff get their tenures back on track. But it is interesting, this lack of investment in the pass rush. They were basically putting all their hopes into, as Matt mentioned, making Vic Beasley live up to that contract, getting more out of Takk McKinley. Vic Beasley has improved. He's certainly played more at a level that is reminiscent of that 2016 season. But even then, again, if you're really looking at that 2016 season with, sober eyes, you're not really saying that he was worth $13 million that particular year when you take a deeper look beyond just sort of how many sacks he had. And then Takk McKinley hasn't quite lived up to expectation. I think Takk tends to get a bad rap from certain corners of the fan base. But, the expectation, the hope was that he was going to be like a 60 pressure guy, a 70 pressure guy, possibly even more. He'd be sort of that player in the same mold as a Frank Clark, and really hasn't been that type of playmaker for this Falcon defense. He's had some moments in recent weeks, and Takk's toughness should be unquestioned, which is something we mentioned on yesterday's episode or last week's episode in terms of his ability and willingness to play hurt this past year. But you go to the secondary, which I think has been a major reason why this defense fell so hard, which was they were counting on Isaiah Oliver to replace Robert Alford and DeMonte Casey to replace Brian Poole. I was very close to putting Brian Poole as one of my specific grievances, but I'll just sort of lump it into this one. And sort of the idea that they were confident that with the youth at that cornerback position that they would get significant better play from that group. They did not really get that. They were confident in their ability to coach up Kendall Sheffield, who certainly had his moments as a rookie, but has been far from a finished product and is several years away, in my opinion, from being that, based off of what I've seen this season. And so it's been one of those things where I think the Falcons, as a kind of got a little full of themselves and kind of rested on the idea that, we can sort of figure it out. And that kind of blew up in their face, particularly in the first half of the season, where I think a lot of their issues were because they put a lot of trust in their ability to coach up some guys that really hadn't earned that trust quite yet based off of their play in recent years, particularly looking at some of their pass rushers, and then with a bunch of sort of green, young secondary players. And it kind of blew up in their face. And I think that's been a major issue. And I think ultimately, if and when, in my opinion, when, but I'll say if, for those of you out there that are still holding out hope that Dan Quinn is going to retain his job, if and when this staff and potentially front office as well is fired, I think we have to look directly at sort of, for lack of a better term, the hubris in thinking that the talent that we had acquired from 2015 to 2017 was more than enough to get this defense playing at a high level, which was a belief that a lot of fans and media thought coming off of the heels of that 2017 season. But I think history has sort of taught us, and hindsight has sort of taught us, even despite the recent defensive turnaround, that wasn't necessarily true. They've certainly played better in the second half of the season since they made some changes to the coaching staff. But I don't know if that's going to be enough to quite save Dan Quinn's job. Yeah,
I mean, you could say a lot has blown up in the face of him and the whole staff, and that's what we saw. That was the product of the first 8 weeks, and they've done some damage control. But like you said, is it going to be enough? We went kind of at length last week's show about kind of the laundry list of stuff that you can place at the doorstep of Dan Quinn and, maybe to a lesser extent, Thomas Dimitroff. So for me, it just comes down to, is Arthur Blank savvy enough? Can we give him the benefit of the doubt of seeing all this stuff and taking it all under consideration? Because, certainly, we didn't get here by accident. And there's a reason that the Falcons are in the hole that they put themselves in. And, again, the quote that Jeff Schultz has as far as, when he had a couple weeks ago with, Matt Ryan being 36 in 2021 and Julio Jones being 32. And, what does that make Arthur Blank think as far as, if he gives Dan Quinn one more shot and we have a repeat of 2019 and 2020, at that point, he's got to probably be thinking like, this current group of players, it's probably over with. It's going to be tough for, a new coaching staff because you likely expect a 1-year learning curve. You'd expect them to get this team over the mountaintop. So for me, I could speak as a fan. That certainly depresses me a little bit as far as thinking about that. So that's why I think the moment's here now to make the move. And I think you also have to consider, like, sure, the players enjoy playing for Dan Quinn. And, I don't think that wasn't the case for Mike Smith either. But you also got to think, there's a sense of comfortability with that too, which, when you get too comfortable, I think, you get led astray. And I think that was part of the issue early in the season is everyone was too comfortable. And Jeff even made that point when he came on our show during the bye week is the players got a little too comfortable and, didn't really maybe notice the ramifications of that comfortability. So, while it's all well and good that you like to play for your coach, I think there's got to be more there. And again, that's just why I think for me, we've made it pretty clear, but I think the time is now, and I'm just hoping that Arthur Blank can see that and hopefully can realize that too. But, we'll find out, I think, next week.
Yeah. We're gonna do a Monday night show next week as well. So potentially we will be talking we probably won't be talking very much about the Buccaneers game if certain things do or do not happen on next week's show. So definitely want to stay tuned to that. We still got a couple of questions, Matt. You want to get into some of these mailbag questions that we got submitted on Twitter? The first one comes from Brian at your homeboy Brian. He asks, do you think the Falcons will cut Keanu Neal and Ito Smith this offseason because they're injury prone?
No. With Ito Smith, there's really no reason. He's on a cheap rookie contract. His cap hits around $800,000 next year. So no, there's really no reason to do that. Keanu Neal, I guess there's a small sliver chance, again, depending on who's here, who's calling the shots, maybe they want to save the $6 million and they really feel like Keanu Neal can't get back to being the same player. But again, very small. I don't think that's going to be in the cards. I think, you're going to want to try to bring Keanu back. And, the hope is that he's going to get back to playing at that Pro Bowl strong safety level of play. Because when he's out there, he's certainly a difference maker for this team.
I think the thing with Keanu Neal, from what I understand it, the way the fifth-year option works is guaranteed for injury. So the fact that Keanu Neal has that Achilles injury means that salary is pretty much guaranteed. The whole guarantee for injury is dependent on guys like being able to pass the physical, and I'm pretty confident that Keanu Neal is not going to be able to pass his year in physical coming off of that Achilles injury. So I don't think they can really cut Keanu Neal. Now, they could cut him and just eat the money, but I don't necessarily see that
what's
as
the
a
point of
reality.
doing that?
Yeah, just for, even if you think there's only a 22% chance that Keanu Neal comes back and plays well in 2020, just what's the harm in trying to get that opportunity?
I mean, that's certainly something we have to look into, because I always thought the injury guarantee was in that year that it happens, but once the new year turns over, again, I mean, it is that year-end physical. That's your understanding of what?
That's what I understand.
Okay.
We'll get some clarity on that. But
yeah,
from what I gather, that 5th-year option is pretty much guaranteed for injury, and what that means is basically if the guy can't pass his physical, he's pretty much guaranteed that money. I think that was one of the things that, at least I recall talking about last year with Vic Beasley, was the hope was with that 5th-year option, the hope was that he wouldn't get hurt, because if he did get hurt, the Falcons would be on the books for paying the entirety of that money, which they wound up doing anyway. So I would agree with Matt that there's really no downside to keeping Ito Smith at this point in time. We'll sort of see what the concussion situation is for him after the season. We know that there are times where players don't get over these concussions. My hope, I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic, that it won't be an issue for Ito Smith moving forward, but we'll just sort of have to wait and see what the status is. But I think sitting here today, I'm not counting on Ito Smith to be firmly in the Falcons' plans, long-term plans at that running back position moving forward. It's not to sit here and say that he can't wind up playing his way into that if and when he comes back. But I don't think the Falcons are going to really factor in sort of when they potentially address the running back position that, oh, wait, we don't need to do this because Ito Smith is coming back and he's going to be whatever for us moving forward.
Yeah.
A Falcons fan MVP at Ryan 2 Jones asks, which one do you think is more likely to happen? Ed Dodds becoming our general manager for the 2020 season, or Mike McCarthy becoming our head coach for 2020?
Yeah, I'm going to stick with Mike McCarthy. That's kind of been what I've said as far as, who I think is most likely to be the next head coach. Because I think it's still very unclear what they do with Thomas Dimitroff, as we've said repeatedly on the show. I would expect that they're going to be a package deal. I know, Jeff Schultz wrote an article in The Athletic about this, kind of the 4 different scenarios, and his second, or I think the one he had second most likely in terms of his gut thinking is that Dimitroff and Quinn both go. He actually has as his top one that they're both going to stay, but he made the note that he doesn't think it's going to sit well if they keep Dimitroff but let Quinn go. He doesn't think that'll sit well with the locker room, and I think he probably has a point there. So I think if Dan Quinn goes, and again I still think that's going to be the outcome, then Dimitroff's going to go, but I don't necessarily think you see McCarthy and Dodds. I mean, Dodds is my favorite choice for the GMs, but I don't know. Maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to be the guy that the Falcons end up going with. I hope so, and maybe he doesn't even end up leaving. I've read in places where Dodds is kind of a guy that likes to just continue to be behind the scenes and doesn't really want that. So maybe he doesn't even want a general manager job at any spot. So for me, obviously, we know Mike McCarthy wants to get back out there, wants to be a head coach in 2020. So I think that's a more likely scenario for the Falcons than Ed Dodds to be general manager.
Yeah, no, I think, for me, I've been pretty confident the last several weeks in saying there's like a 99% chance, in my humble opinion, that Dan Quinn is going to get fired. I will move that down to a 97% chance. I think the Jacksonville game sort of makes it 2% more likely that Dan Quinn will keep his job. So, and then sort of looking at Dimitroff, I feel like it's likely that he'll be fired, but I don't think it's sort of as much of a slam dunk as I sort of see the Falcons moving on from Dan Quinn. So I will probably, to throw a number at it, I will say there's like a 74% chance that Dimitroff gets fired. And based off of that alone, given the availability of the job, I think you would sort of say McCarthy. Not to mention sort of some of the many things that Matt has said over the last several weeks. And in regards to McCarthy, if Arthur Blank is of the mindset of this team is ready to compete right away and doesn't have to rebuild, I don't want to spend too many, more than, half a season sort of reloading, rebuilding, whatever. Mike McCarthy's being a long tenured coach in this league, having won a Super Bowl, being, a guy that can come in and bring a similar offense to what Kyle Shanahan ran here in Atlanta, at least stylistically, philosophically, they run a very similar offense. So I think that makes sense. And then going back to what Matt said with Ed Dodds not necessarily wanting the gig, you're looking at a situation where I think, I think, and then when you look at Arthur Blank's history of hiring GMs, he tends to go with guys that have, either a lot of experience, like a Rich McKay, and success in the past, or a guy like Dimitroff who comes from that sort of pedigree from that New England Patriots. I know Dodds had that time in Seattle, but maybe Arthur Blank, because of the Dan Quinn connection, doesn't want to sort of dip back into that Seattle well quite enough. Not to, again, this is not disparaging Ed Dodds as a candidate in any shape or form, but it's just one of those things where specifically for those two guys, when we're talking about it, it seems like Mike McCarthy is more in line with what Arthur Blank, or at least what I'm assuming Arthur Blank will want in a head coach. And I don't necessarily know if Ed Dodds is quite, based off of his history, what Arthur Blank is looking for in the next GM. So there's my answer on that. But we have a caller from Vlad. Welcome to the show, Vlad.
Hey, how are y'all doing tonight?
Good, Vlad. Good to hear from you. You got any grievances you want to air, Falcons related, or life related in general? The floor is yours, man. What do you want to talk about?
In all honesty, I think most of this team's situation really kind of boils down to just mismanagement. Like, I honestly think Dan Quinn is definitely a good head coach that was in a situation he found himself in to be mishandling this team in many aspects. Like when at the beginning of the year when he had took on the role of the defensive coordinator position also, I don't think he really understood just what that was going to entail as far as like how much extra work that was going to be. And I kind of think that kind of sunk him at the beginning of the season, because I honestly think that if he was to have understood that and actually have chosen a DC instead of going into the season himself, I think we would have had a winning record at this point. Like, I genuinely think we could have been like 9 or even 10 wins at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with any of that. I mean, we're seeing some of the results of Ulbrich and Raheem Morris taking over, and it's safe to wonder like what would have happened if those guys were just calling the shots earlier in the season. I think you're right. I think we would have at least been 4-4 probably at the bye.
Yeah,
and had an outside shot. If Seattle loses in Week 17 against San Francisco and the Falcons take care of business in Tampa Bay, who knows? Maybe the Falcons are 10-6 in the 6th seed in this playoff run. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that I thought for me was the first sign of again, things getting away from Dan Quinn, taking on that role, firing Steve Sarkisian without a clear and obvious upgrade. That's when I think this job started to overwhelm him a little bit, and he felt the pressure, and that's what led to where we're at right now.
Sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
I was just going to piggyback on that point. You just go back to that stretch games between the Colts, Titans, Texans, and the Cardinals, where it really was the defense that was kind of costing the Falcons. The offense wasn't playing great in all of those games either. But like at the very least, you're saying, if we're playing the coulda, woulda, shoulda game, that they should have at least split those games. And if you split those games, you're looking at 8-7 right now. So at the very least. So I kind of agree with you at that point that, that 4-game stretch where the Falcons lost all 4 of those games, in several of those games, I think a lot of people expected the Falcons to win, is the point where it all sort of unraveled for Dan Quinn. And you can certainly point your fingers in addition to some of the issues that the Falcons had on offense in those games, but largely, those were really some of the more abysmal defensive performances that the Falcons had. And it really wasn't until that Week 6 game where they made the switch at halftime to Jeff Ulbrich sort of calling. And then obviously we saw Raheem Morris make those changes, and we've seen improvements since then.
And even in the halftime game right there, when they made the switch at the halftime, spot, you could immediately see a uptick. Like, it wasn't like a significant one versus what we're seeing the last couple of weeks, especially in that San Francisco game. But you could see a difference there. And I guess what I'm alluding to is, do you think Arthur Blank looks at this situation as kind of like what happened in New Orleans, where, they went, 7-9 for like 3 years, and he looks at Dan Quinn and was like, look, this is going to be a learning experience. Because if you ask me, like, Dan Quinn is definitely to blame, but I think more of the blame should go to Thomas Dimitroff, because these free agent acquisitions haven't been like anything, special. Like, the only thing outside of Alex Mack that's been great is maybe like, I don't even know, like maybe Claiborne for 1 year there, maybe, I don't. He just doesn't really seem.
I know you don't want to bring up Sanu with Aaron in the room, but hey, bring up Sanu. that worked out.
Oh yeah, Sanu. Yeah, I'll say Sanu. I was doing Aaron a solid there.
Yeah, no, I could tell. You were doing some gymnastics around that one.
Sanu did work out. Carpenter's been a disaster. Both guards have been a disaster. For the most part. So if you were to ask me as far as like who's to take the brunt of this blame, I honestly think it's more on Dimitroff than it is on Dan Quinn. So for me personally, I've been on the whole, even on Twitter, I've been on the whole, bandwagon of keep Quinn, but Thomas Dimitroff and Dirk Cutter both have to go, because this is a prime example of why most of the time when a head coach is brought in, 9 times out of 10 they bring in a general manager with them.
Yeah. Because
clearly Thomas Dimitroff doesn't understand the personnel this team truly needs to excel, and it's obvious from especially this last offseason.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, we talked about this, Aaron and I, on either last week or the week before, as far as who's calling the shots, and Quinn did get, the last rights to the 53-man roster. So it's very possible that, he's, the one, pushing some of these moves on Dimitroff to make now. Is he saying that, they should overpay for guys like Jamon Brown and James Carpenter? That I don't know, but I think it's entirely possible that he's saying, look, I want to get more physical. I wanted to get bigger up front. We struggled in short yardage situations in 2018. Get me 2 big offensive linemen. I know James Carpenter from my time in Seattle. Get me that guy. Cool. So it's tough. We're just speculating. We don't know the answers to some of these questions, and that's
Well, on the flip side of that too, what if Thomas Dimitroff's like, okay, here's a list of the players we can get out of this list. Who do you want?
Yeah.
We
don't know. That's very possible. What's going on, and
like technically he has final say over the 53-man roster, but it's like when you're looking at apples and oranges as far as talent,
Yeah.
And most of them are
for me. That's why I continue to label them as a partnership, because I think they're both equally at fault in certain regards. And, while I'm 100% down for getting rid of Dirk Cutter, I don't see a scenario where, Arthur Blank, says Dan Quinn can stay, but you got to fire an offensive coordinator for the second time in as many years. Like, I don't see that happening. Like, I wish I could see that happening. I wish I could see that future. But if Dan Quinn stays, I think they're going to give Dirk Cutter another year. They're going to say, all right, year 2, usually with Matt Ryan, an offensive coordinator, usually works out better. I'm going to give this one more shot. And at that point, I think we're making a grave mistake by letting Dan Quinn back, because, Dirk Cutter is going to be coming back too with him. And that's just why I think it's time. You brought up the New Orleans comparison, and I think if they would have finished, I hate to bring up the Super Bowl, but if they would have just finished that quarter out and they would have just finished that game and been Super Bowl champions, then at that point, sure, Dan Quinn gets a longer leash.
That's exactly
he gets the benefit of the doubt, and sure, 2 7-9 seasons, won't cripple him or won't, put him on the unemployment line in a similar vein that it didn't do that for Sean Payton in New Orleans. But because he didn't get the job done, and, because they're slipping further and further away from kind of the vision and kind of from where this team was several years ago, I just think it's run its course, and we got one little last window here with Matt Ryan and Julio Jones at their peak, and it's time, I think, to try to get an offensive minded guy in here to get the most out of these guys and put them in a position, because I think it's run its course, and we've seen the best we can see from Dan Quinn as the head coach of this team.
Now, with that being said, going back to earth with it, that's obvious. The obvious, scenario is all of them are gone, and that's what I'm expecting, honestly. But what I was getting at basically too is I would understand it if that was a move that was made. It may be hated amongst the fan base, but I could understand it. Is what I'm saying. But as far as like what's more in the realm of reality, I think they clean house and they bring a whole new everything in basically.
Yeah, I mean, again, nothing at this point really shocks me with what the Falcons do. So if Dan Quinn's back, like, again, I'm not gonna be shocked. Like, I'm gonna see kind of why Arthur Blank did what he did. Again, I'm not going to agree with it, like you said, but I'm not going to be shocked, and that's why, again, who knows what's going to happen at this point? We're all just speculating this entire season, or for the last several weeks here on the show, of what we think's going to happen. But Arthur Blank is keeping this one, tight to the vest, and it's anyone's best guess. I mean, we've said the history of this would be the first coach that's survived 2 playoff-less seasons and lived to tell the story.
That's true.
But Dan Quinn, again, he is a good leader. That he's done great things. I mean, he's brought a culture here. He's brought this brotherhood that you're seeing all these coaches throughout the NFL talk about a brotherhood. Like today, I heard John Harbaugh talking about the brotherhood of the Baltimore Ravens. And, before Dan Quinn and before Atlanta, I never heard any coach talk about the brotherhood really in the NFL, at least not in the NFL, maybe in college. But he's certainly brought a culture, and he's certainly the CEO type. But, is he, again, the right football mind to get the job done? Because I do think you need to have both elements. You need to be a CEO, you need to be a leader, but you also need to have that football aspect of it. And, I've seen aspects of it where he's lacking in that regard. And so, for some of those reasons, I just think, again, you have to make tough calls in this business. And Arthur's got, probably the toughest one he's ever had to make upcoming. But
100% agree.
We'll see what happens.
My next question would be, as far as GM candidates, is anybody in mind that you would have like an ideal fit for this team that you would like to bring in?
I mean, we just got done talking about Ed Dodds a little bit, and he's kind of at the top of my list just because I think he values the same types of things that the Falcons have valued over the last couple of years, as far as from an athleticism standpoint. He had quite a tenure in Seattle in their front office. Now he's jumped over to Indianapolis. He's the right-hand man at Chris Ballard, and they've sort of applied some of those same principles. So, I think it would be a seamless fit because, again, I do think Dan Quinn's done some good things bringing in athletes to play in the NFL, and that's what you need. You need athletes to play in this league, but you also, you need the football IQ as well from a player standpoint. But, I think Ed Dodds values some of those same things, and, he's been long regarded as one of the top scouts. It's just a matter of, does he want this opportunity? Because, I've heard that he's kind of a behind the scenes type of guy, and maybe that's the life for him. Aaron brought up some of the points why he might not be a fit just a minute ago. But he's certainly at the top of my list. I've been going through some candidates. I'm thinking about writing an article here in the next week or so. Kind of been holding off till I got some more information on some things, but, might pull the trigger on that in the next week or two. But he's certainly at the top. There's a couple other guys, but Aaron, do you have any other candidates that you haven't kind of brought up anything as far as that?
I haven't done a whole lot of research into GM candidates because, again, I think part of it is going back to what I said earlier, where my expectation is Arthur Blank is going to want to win now, and so he's going to go for more of a splashier head coach hire. And that guy, you're not going to be able to attract sort of the big name coach that's going to want to concede personnel power to somebody else. Like, that's something that you're only really going to get with a first-time head coach that's basically getting his first real gig. But a retread or, some big name from college isn't going to make that jump with the idea of sort of, well, I need to report to a general manager type of person. So that's part of the reason why I haven't necessarily done as much digging on the GM possibilities in terms of who's the best fit, because my expectation at least for the last several weeks has been that Arthur Blank's going to want to make a big splashy hire at the head coaching position. And I don't think, not to say it doesn't matter who the GM is at that point, but it's going to be more of a relationship like we saw in Seattle, where they went out and got Pete Carroll, and then he sort of picked John Schneider to be his GM, rather than what it was when we hired Dimitroff, where they went out and got Dimitroff, and then he hired Mike Smith, or when he hired Rich McKay, and then he brought in Jim Moore. So that's my expectation at this point in time. Obviously, that's pure speculating. That's me guessing at this point in time. So that's part of the reason why I haven't been sort of as looking ahead towards sort of options for the GM spot. Plus, it's like, how do you know what is a good GM? Because it's all sort of like
that's true.
Guys that are like pro scout directors or whatever, and it's like, do you look at the team's free agent signings as like, but then how much of that is him versus the actual GM of that team? Like, how can you really judge these things? So that's part of it where I can't really look at someone's resume as unless you have situations like you have with Ned Dodds, where several people have sort of pointed out specific moves that he has sort of pounded the table for in Seattle and Indianapolis that at least gives you an idea of sort of, you can say he was the guy that led to that move, or he was the guy that led to this move. But for most other GM possible candidates, what do you know about that?
Definitely agree. So do you see somebody like, Arthur Blank going out and pushing for somebody like a Gary Kubiak or something like that as far as that big splashy hire?
I think, unfortunately, I think we have to let the Gary Kubiak dream
never
die. Because, the thing with Gary Kubiak, I mean, he's in Minnesota now. He's in an advisory role. And, we certainly have to watch what happens with their offense coordinator, Kevin Stefanski, who is, one of my favorites for, a potential head coaching job. Do I think he's going to get it in Atlanta? No. But you have to see what happens there, because if he goes somewhere, I think Mike Zimmer is going to want to have him be the offensive coordinator, or at least, maybe they elevate his son, Clint Kubiak, to offense coordinator, and still have his dad, Gary, be the advisor role. Like, I don't think Mike Zimmer is going to let Gary Kubiak leave town.
If he's smart, he won't.
Yeah. So I think, again, it would have been nice, but we had our opportunity there to just hold on and be a little bit more patient, until Kubiak got out of Elway's contract, or Elway got, let him out of his contract in Denver. And at that point, that was the opportunity to pounce. But, as we saw, Falcons weren't patient. They jumped in to bed with Dirk Cutter, and, now we're here, suffering the consequences of that. So, again, I've been trying to tell people on Twitter, I think the Gary Kubiak dream is dead at this point. I think he's going to stay in Minnesota. He's enjoying just kind of being an advisor at this point in his career, and it's unlikely he can either. He's outright said he doesn't want to be a head coach anymore. So really, the only other spot is being an offensive coordinator, and I guess it's technically not a lateral move because he's just an advisor right now. So he could, but I think Minnesota would do all that they can, whether it's putting him in that offensive coordinator role, or, doing some sort of kind of, legal loopholes so that they don't, let him leave Minnesota.
So are y'all's like head candidates, like as far as the next head coach, have they changed at all, or are they?
So I'll give you my top four. My top four in this order: Kevin Stefanski, offensive coordinator from the Vikings; Eric Bieniemy, offensive coordinator of the Chiefs. People might not like to hear it, but my third one is Mike McCarthy. And my fourth one is kind of a wild card, and it's Mike McDaniel, the run game coordinator from San Francisco 49ers, guy who's been with Kyle Shanahan every step of the way. He hasn't necessarily been tasked with like leading a team or running an offense, but he's a guy that, I would bet on. If you're asking for a wild card to just bet on, kind of like, the next Sean McVay, that would be the guy that I would take a chance on it if it got to that stage. So those are my four. Again, I think Mike McCarthy's more likely, just because I think Arthur Blank does want a more established guy. So I think he's going to like what McCarthy's going to tell him in the interview. And, if that's what happens, I would just caution people to have an open mind about it. I know it doesn't sound good, and you're going to think back on how his tenure ended in Green Bay, but, I don't think that was all his fault. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, Stefanski's my top guy too. What about you, Aaron?
I don't have a guy that I want, but in terms of like 5 candidates that intrigue me, not to say that I think the Falcons should hire one of these 5 guys, but just as from an intriguing standpoint, like, oh, that would be an interesting move. Like my 5 guys in no particular order are Don Martindale, the Ravens defensive coordinator, Greg Roman, the Ravens offensive coordinator, Urban Meyer, the former Ohio State head coach, Lincoln Riley, the current Oklahoma head coach, and who's the other guy? Josh McDaniels, just because I'm curious to sort of see what Josh McDaniels can do as sort of his second stint as a head coach, and given some of the success he's had on offense for the last 10, 15 years, dating back in New England. So those are the 5 guys that intrigue me the most. But in terms of like, am I standing for any one of those guys? Not really. It's just those would be like, oh, that's an interesting hire type of things. At this point in time, I'm more of the mindset of sort of what's the most interesting hire that will at least, not necessarily the big splash one, but just kind of the buzziest one that's going to be the most interesting move to me, rather than just sort of like, here's a hot offensive coordinator, here's a hot defensive coordinator, let's elevate him to a head coaching job. Like, that's just what everybody does. And that's cool, but like, whatever, man.
I will say, if there's, again, I've been pushing the offensive minded guy, but if there is, the Falcons went defensive minded, Don Wink Martindale would be the guy that I'd like to see them pursue. Because I think just seeing some of the pictures of him with his Ravens defense flashing the guns and stuff. I mean, he's got the swagger that he could bring a similar culture that Dan Quinn's brought, and I think he does have the defensive mind that he is an X's and O's guy that he could flourish in that role. Maybe like a Vic Fangio is starting to flourish a little bit out in Denver after he finally got a chance to be a head coach. So I'd be very intrigued by that if again they opted to go defense for the 3rd straight hire. So I'll say that about Martindale. What about you, Vlad? Do you have? I mean, you said Stefanski. Any other?
I mean, pretty much nailed it between both of you. Yeah. I couldn't argue with any of them, honestly.
Yeah, I would just say, to everyone out there, just have an open mind with this process. I didn't necessarily do that back when they were hiring Dan Quinn, and I was all in on Rex Ryan, and look how that turned out. We did hire the right guy in Dan Quinn. So again, I'm hopefully going to learn my lesson. Knock on wood. I'm not going to jinx myself there, but just keep an open mind with this. There is a good amount of candidates out there. So if we're in the position that that's what we have to do, and hire one of them, just everyone out there, keep an open mind about it, and we'll see where it takes us.
Yeah, that's I say this every year when it comes to situations like this, coaching staff, potential hires, as well as the draft every year. You just kind of have to have an open mind. Like, no one knows what's going to happen. And it's not to say like you're not allowed to have an opinion. It's not to sit here and say that you're not allowed to have a favorite candidate. But none of us can sort of tell the future, and sort of the tendency that I think people have to want to fight other people about things that neither party has really a clue how it's going to turn out, I think, is one of those things that people need to sort of pump the brakes on. Like, you're allowed to think, oh, this coach would be a good hire, this coach wouldn't be a great hire, this draft pick would be the best possible first round pick for the Falcons, or, this guy shouldn't trade up for. You're allowed to have those opinions, but I just think at the end of the day, it's just like, I think this, but what do I know? I'm just a guy sitting here, in a chair in front of a computer, having no clue what's going on. So I would say for people, just learn to be a little bit more open-minded about the infinite possibilities in this infinite, multiverse of realities. And one of those is, the guy that you hate. The Falcons hire that guy, and he actually winds up doing the thing that you want, which is win a Super Bowl. So that's what I'll say.
So one last thing, and I'll get out of y'all's hair. As far as this team's biggest need currently, what do you think would be the position? Just edge rusher still, I'm assuming?
Probably, although, I agree with Aaron. I think the coverage aspect of this defense, has almost let them down more than the pass rush has this year. And, fans might not believe that, but that absolutely is the case. I mean, we talked, or at least I talked ad nauseum about, them giving up easy reads, quick reads, letting the quarterback out, get the ball out of his hands quick. That had a lot to do with defense's struggles, when they were 1-7. So I do think there's some needs in the secondary. I don't think this cornerback group, is any way solidified, but, just based on the fact that, there's quite a few options already under contract at cornerback. I think, yes, probably edge rusher is the obvious need just because, you have Tack McKinley under contract and, that's about it. But again, I'm at a point where it's best player available on defense because I just think this defense needs playmakers. So depending on where they fall in the draft and who's the best defensive player on the board at a particular juncture, that's who I think they should take, regardless of kind of what position they play at. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think the stance. I kind of think they need front four help, pass rushing help, as well as coverage help, kind of equally. But I think because they have more bodies in the secondary than they have on the front four, when you look at a lot of the turnover where really you just have Grady Jarrett, John Kaminsky, Deidrin Senat, and that's really, I feel Tack McKinley under contract for next season. You need to have, potentially up to 10 options in your rotation on your D line. So that's at least, potentially 6 more bodies that they're going to have to add. While when you look at the secondary, because of Trufant and Allen and Neal and Casey and Oliver and Sheffield and all these guys are under contract, you don't need as many bodies in your secondary. But, the point I would bring is like when this team's pass rush plays well, their defense plays well. And I think, to some people that's like, oh, well, that's just proof that it's more important to add pass rushers. But I would argue that that's kind of evidence that the back end has not been very good this season, that when the defensive line plays well enough and gets pressure on the quarterback to basically hide and mask the fact that the back end isn't particularly good is when this Falcons defense looks good. But, you can take that and say that means they should invest more in their defense because I don't necessarily know how much their back end is going to improve next season, particularly if they don't make a change at the coaching staff. But that is one of those things that I think is a factor. So I think, basically any pass rusher, whether it's a D-tackle or an edge rusher, is their number one need. But I certainly think, cornerback is, pretty high on the list at this point in time. But certainly if push came to shove, I definitely, all things being equal, I would definitely go with the best pass rusher over the best cornerback. But certainly that's the whole point of the draft is all things are never equal, because you value players differently.
Yeah, definitely agree. If I had to put them in order, I definitely agree. It'd probably be edge rusher, probably a corner, and probably a center, just to kind of have somebody behind Mac because he's getting up there in age. Me and my other buddy was having a conversation the other day about Chase Young because until we're picking in the 20s,
that might be another dream we need to let die, Vlad.
I'm not letting it go. We were having the conversation. Let's say we were picking at 14, like we did last year when we got Lindstrom.
We're not in a position. We're not one player away anymore.
You don't think so?
That's where I'd start the conversation off. At this point, even though we have that second round pick now in our back pocket.
You knew exactly where I was going with it.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly the ammunition that used to trade up. But yeah. I wish we could be there, but I think we have to get our sights set. And, I'm starting to, again, I haven't really started with a lot of draft prep yet. I want to see exactly where they fall, but this could be Javon Kinlaw season. This could be a prime opportunity. He's kind of, Derek Brown's been talked about a lot about, being the prized defensive tackle, and we're probably out of the range of him now at this point. But Javon Kinlaw could be a good consolation prize.
I started looking at him ever since
next to Grady Jarrett. Yeah, I mean, he struggled with consistency issues coming in, but he certainly used this year at South Carolina to be a more consistent presence. And I think he's going to be a guy that's going to kind of blow up the combine. So, again, if we're looking at getting more pass rushers, he's kind of the next guy that I have in the back of my head now, where Atlanta's picking, where they don't have to trade up. Because I just think they need as many cheap, affordable contracts as they can get, just based on, their restrictions in the salary cap, because they're a little top heavy with some of the star players they're paying. They need some cheap, affordable capital. And, again, I think having those 3 picks in the top 60 or whatever it's going to be, I think that's going to be too important to pass up for one Chase Young, unfortunately.
In a bubble, yeah, Chase Young would be nice, but in reality, I definitely agree that it's something, because that's ultimately what we came to the consensus of, was the way this team's structured as far as contracts and the depth right now on talent. Like, we're going to need those extra picks to kind of replace the guys we let go in free agency. As much as I hate to say that, because I'd love to see Chase Young.
Yeah, he's going to be a generational guy, and
yeah, he is. He's
probably going to terrorize the NFC East for years to come. But thankfully, it doesn't sound like he'll be in the NFC South, and that's the one saving grace there. But Vlad, we appreciate talking with you, man. Wish you and your family Merry Christmas, and hopefully we can chat with you again soon, maybe even next week.
Happy holidays to y'all too, and Merry Christmas. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, Vlad.
All right. To sort of put the finishing touches on that point about Chase Young is, I think you're right, Matt. We're not one player away. And I think that's kind of, and we were talking about this before we jumped on, sort of kind of the idea kind of driving me to sort of, push a little bit for the Falcons to move on from Dan Quinn, because I think, that Chase Young sort of thing, of this idea of sort of like, we just need that one last piece to get over the hump, is this mindset that I think has been kind of holding this team back the last couple of years. And I think it's time to finally break this mindset of sort of looking for that one piece that's going to get this team over the hump. And really still, we're chasing that 2016 season. We're trying to sort of relive that 2016 season, not only from let's, hire an offensive coordinator that will sort of bring back that Kyle Shanahan type of offense, but, now sort of the idea, if you're talking about trading up, whether it's for Chase Young, whether it's for Ed Oliver, whether it's for Brian Burns, whether it's for Christian Wilkins, whoever people sort of put on that pedestal last year, this idea of sort of, we're just, a couple of tweaks away from getting right back to the Super Bowl. And I kind of think the team needs to break themselves of this mindset and sort of not necessarily rebuild, but kind of reload and start fresh with a new coach, new perspective, new GM, whatever, but just sort of like, we're moving forward. We're past 2016. It's 2020 now. That's the old regime. That's what they did. That has nothing to do with me. If I'm the head coach, if I'm the GM, none of that has anything to do with me. Let's build so that when Matt Ryan is 36 and 37, when Julio Jones is 32 and 33, that we can have a roster that will allow those guys, when they're not necessarily as capable as they have been in the past to sort of carry this team, we can build up a roster with guys like Calvin Ridley and Austin Hooper and Lindstrom and Isaiah Oliver and Sheffield and Deion Jones and Grady Jarrett and Javon Kinlaw and whoever else that we can get that can build up this type of team so that we can compete at the highest levels 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road and move forward, as opposed to keeping on looking back. And I think while Chase Young is, as you say, probably going to be the player that I think a lot of us thought Jadeveon Clowney was going to be, in that sort of generation dominant, best pass rusher in 15, 20 years type of player for whoever lands him, that doesn't solve the Falcons' problem. Okay, if you put Chase Young on the Falcons, you have Chase Young, you have Grady Jarrett, you have Deion Jones. You still need 8 other players on your defense. Does that fix the offensive line? No. Does that, allow you to run the football? No. Is that going to give you another option in your passing game in addition to Hooper and Jones and Ridley when those guys are hurt, or when Julio Jones is declining, a couple of years down the road and is not the player that he has been this season and in previous years? No, Chase Young doesn't fix any of those issues. So that idea that we're one player away, I think people tend to overrate.
Yeah, amen. And I think that would be the cool thing about bringing in a guy like Ed Dodds or even maybe one of the Ravens co-GMs or co-directors of player personnel, because that's the type of philosophy that those teams have had, as far as not trading up and thinking you're one player away, but trading back and continuing to keep the cupboard, stacked with assets and not necessarily rely on, 1 to 2 to 3 players on your team. So that's kind of why, I'm big on Ed Dodds, is because I think if he were to be the GM here, you'd be doing a complete 180 as far as philosophy goes. And instead of thinking about trading up for a guy like Chase Young, you'd be thinking about trading back into the first round, accumulating picks, again, to try to build this team up. And so it's not so reliant on a guy like Matt or Julio or Grady Jarrett. So, that's something to consider, food for thought, as far as, you're right. Trying to turn the page, a new chapter in Atlanta Falcons history, and get away from that 2016 cloud that keeps hanging over, and, starting fresh and starting anew. So hopefully, we'll kind of be talking about that and prospecting about that on next Monday's show, Black Monday. But, the only people that know what's going to happen is Arthur Blank and God. So we'll find out next week, and hopefully we have a lot to talk about and a lot to uncover on next Monday's show.
Yeah. So we want to say, Merry Christmas to all of you guys out there celebrating. If you're not celebrating Christmas, then have a Happy New Year. We will certainly be back before the New Year is up with New Year's Eve next Tuesday, I believe, which is part of the reason why we are doing this show next Monday instead, because we don't, people want to have fun Tuesday night. So no one wants to be sitting here talking Falcons. I love talking Falcons, but let's
not even me. I don't even want to be talking Falcons next Tuesday. So.
Yeah, so we will definitely be coming back next Monday, potentially talking about this Buccaneers game. But the expectation I think both Matt and I have right now is we're going to be talking quite a bit about the coaching move that was or was not made Monday morning on next week's show. So you definitely want to stay tuned to that. And, of course, for you to get those updates on when we will go live on Monday night, you definitely want to subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube channel. Check out profootballcentral.com for all the links to the audio version of this podcast, where you can find us on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, as well as other platforms. Check us out on Twitter at FalcFans, FalcFans. That's me. And Matt is, of course, at Matt Karoly, MattKaroly. Of course, you can check out the show's Twitter handle at Falcons PFC. Check us out on Falcons Central Radio as well on Facebook. We know that we haven't put a lot of content up there as of this season, but certainly when we get into the off season, we'll be featuring a lot more sort of quick content on the Facebook page for this show. Matt, I know you plugged an article that you're working on currently right now, but go ahead and plug whatever else you want before we wrap up tonight.
Yeah, as I kind of alluded to, and I have been alluding to, still, wrapping my head around, part 2 of my Falcon Eye to the Future series. Part 1 was looking into head coaching candidates, offensive-minded head coaching candidates. I said part 2 will likely be on the GMs. I kind of want to get a definitive answer one way or another what the future holds, because I don't want to write this article and then it's kind of gets thrown in the trash and it's not really worth the time or worth people looking into. So, I might hold off on, let's see what happens on Black Monday, but that's my plan right now, is to talk about the GMs. If not, I'll kind of pivot towards free agency stuff. And then obviously part 3 is going to be about the draft and what potential draft picks, draft prospects the Falcons might be looking at, in April's draft. So that'll be at Rise Up Reader. I'll keep everyone in the loop on Twitter and then obviously here on the show. But that's what's up on deck for me as far as a writing standpoint goes.
Okay, guys. Once again, have a happy holidays. Enjoy your Christmas. Enjoy your New Year's. We will see you next Monday, probably at 8 o'clock, to talk more Falcons and potential coaching changes. So have a good evening, guys. Merry Christmas.